All right, so let's finish up chapter 8. So what happens if free oxygen, O2, is not available? What if we cannot do aerobic cellular respiration? Does that mean that our cells can't make any energy? Well, of course not. Okay? So what we know is that anaerobic respiration can take place if oxygen is not available. Maybe I should say, instead of oxygen, free oxygen is not available. What if the oxygen is tied up with some other element like nitrogen or sulfur or carbon or whatever? Well, the key here is that they still can make ATP. They just can't make as much as they would make if oxygen was present. So what we say is that most obligate anaerobes, most obligate anaerobes are going to use the hydrogens that are made during glycolysis to reduce that oxygen compound that's not just oxygen by itself. So we know that it's going to use that hydrogen to help break down that nitrate or that sulfate or that carbonate. Okay, so again, anaerobic respiration. Remember, glycolysis is going to happen regardless, isn't it? Okay, yes. And then we're going to go into the Krebs cycle. The difference is that instead of having O2 available, we don't have O by itself. We have O bound up with something else, so we're not going to make quite as much oxygen as we did last time. Okay? Fermentation, on the other hand, is when there's absolutely no oxygen available. There's just no oxygen available. And we call that, in the absence of oxygen, anaerobic. We say that then the bottom line is that some other organic compound is the terminal electron acceptor, and we know that we're only going to make 2 ATPs, and we know that either alcohol or some other organic acid is going to be made. And believe it or not, there's a lot of things that we use that use fermentation and don't use oxygen, and thus a lot of things that we actually use and enjoy are made through the process called fermentation. So, looking at fermentation, glycolysis is going to happen, but if no oxygen is available at all, then fermentation either makes lactic acid or makes alcohol and carbon dioxide. Okay, so the byproducts of fermentation are either lactic acid or ethanol, like drinking alcohol, and carbon dioxide. So, examples. Have you ever worked out to the point that you could not do one more sit-up, push-up, run? Yeah, of course you have. So typically what has happened is that you have held your breath, or there's not enough oxygen available, and what begins to build up in your muscles is this thing called lactic acid. You and I might refer to it as the burn. Okay, when our muscles burn, then that means that lactic acid is being built up. Some organisms, like for example yeast, can take the glucose, turn it into pyruvic acid, but instead will turn it into alcohol, right, like drinking alcohol, and give off CO2 gas. So again, remember, they've been around a long time. If no oxygen is present, they have learned to be efficient and turn it into something else that their little organism, their little cells can use. So, do you remember glucose is split into pyruvate? Well, look at what pyruvate can then be turned into. And again, I'm not going to make you know all these products. I just simply want you to see that one pyruvate molecule can actually be used to make a lot depending on what the cell needs. And again, here's a great chart for helping you to break down what happens in aerobic respiration, what happens in anaerobic respiration, what happens in fermentation. And again, it kind of helps you to see that cells are very efficient. They use what they have, and if something's not available, they've learned other mechanisms to try to get the energy that they need to survive. Okay? As a matter of fact, we often say that often metabolic processes are amphibolic. Amphibolic, which means more than one side. They can be used either way. And so I love this chart in that it says, okay, let's start off with glucose. Okay, we know that glucose can be broken down in glycolysis and be turned into pyruvic acid and then be turned into acetyl-CoA, which can then be broken down into other molecules. Well, guess what? Glucose can also be broken down through glycolysis and turned into amino acids. Or it can be broken down into pyruvate and acetyl-CoA and be turned into fatty acids and lipids. And it can be turned into amino acids, which can then be turned into nucleotides. The bottom line is this. When glucose gets split into pyruvic acid, okay, that is a magic molecule, that glyceride 3-phosphate, G3P. That one molecule can then be turned into whatever that cell needs. So think about that. Bacteria don't necessarily have to hunt for proteins and nucleic acids and carbohydrates and fats. If they find a carb, sugar, and they break it down, that one molecule can then be used to make all the other molecules that that little cell needs. And that's pretty efficient. Okay, that's pretty efficient. So, look at this one. What includes incomplete oxidation of glucose or other carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen? Key there being absence of oxygen. That's right, fermentation. When there is absolutely no oxygen present, then fermentation is going to occur. Okay? And honestly, that's how organisms survive, whether oxygen is present or whether it's not. This is how they've survived for so long, and honestly, why they'll still be here when we aren't. All right? So that wraps it up for Chapter 8.